3 properties, 3 generations, 30 years of tragedy. The Kennedy family built their American dynasty from 3 estates: a compound on Cape Cod, a winter retreat in Palm Beach, a chaotic Virginia manor. These houses witnessed the rise of the most powerful political family in American history. And they witnessed something else. A pattern of loss so consistent, so relentless, that people called it a curse. Joseph Kennedy bought the Hyannisport compound in 1928 with a clear vision. He would create an American aristocracy, not through inherited titles, but through wealth, ambition, and relentless competition. The compound became his training ground. 9 children raised to win at everything: politics, business, even touch football on the lawn. For a brief moment in the early 1960s, it worked. His son was president. The compound became the summer White House. Photographers captured images of an American royal family at play, sailing, laughing, living the dream Joe Kennedy had built. But the houses also witnessed what came after. The deaths that seemed too frequent to be coincidence, the scandals that destroyed reputations, the empty bedrooms that multiplied with each passing decade. By the time the last of Joe Kennedy's children passed away, the properties that had symbolized power and glamour had become monuments to loss. This is the story of how those houses shaped a dynasty and witnessed its unraveling. How 3 properties became stages for both triumph and devastation. How rooms that hosted presidents and senators eventually stood empty, filled only with memories of who had been there and who would never return. We'll explore how Joseph Kennedy strategically chose these locations to build his family's image. How the compound's competitive atmosphere forged political careers, but also created unbearable pressure. How tragedy after tragedy transformed these estates from symbols of success into reminders of how quickly fortune can turn. Let's begin in 1928, when an ambitious businessman looked at Cape Cod and saw the perfect foundation for building an American dynasty. Chapter 1: The Bootlegger Builds His Kingdom. 1928. Joseph Patrick Kennedy was an outsider who refused to stay outside. Irish Catholic in an America dominated by Protestant elites, son of a Boston saloon keeper and ward boss. He'd made millions through methods that raised eyebrows even in the 1920s. His fortune came from multiple sources: stock market speculation, where he used techniques that would later become restricted; film production in Hollywood, where he ran studios and allegedly had relationships with actresses; and according to rumors that persisted for decades but were never proven in court, bootlegging during Prohibition. Kennedy always denied this, but the whispers followed him. By 1928, at age 40, Kennedy was wealthy. But wealth wasn't enough. He wanted respectability. He wanted his family to matter. And he understood that in America, location signaled status. The right address could open doors that money alone couldn't. Cape Cod was where old money summered. Protestant families with names like Lodge and Saltonstall owned estates along the Massachusetts coast. They'd been there for generations. They didn't welcome newcomers, especially not Irish Catholics who'd made their money recently through questionable means. Kennedy didn't care whether they welcomed him. He was buying in anyway. The property he purchased in Hyannisport was substantial. 6 acres on the waterfront. Not 1 house, but 3. The main residence where he and his wife Rose would live. And 2 smaller houses on the same property. He was planning ahead. His children would grow up here. And when they married, they'd stay here. The compound would keep the family together, under his control. The architecture was classically New England: white clapboard siding, green shutters, porches facing the water. Nothing ostentatious. Kennedy understood that true wealth in WASP America didn't announce itself loudly. It whispered. The houses looked like they could have been there for generations, though they were relatively new. The location was strategic. Hyannisport was close enough to Boston for business, far enough for privacy. The waterfront provided sailing, swimming, recreation. But more importantly, it provided the setting Kennedy needed. If his children grew up summering on Cape Cod like the Protestant elite, they'd seem like the Protestant elite. Background could be manufactured through the right address. Rose Kennedy, Joe's wife, took charge of managing the compound. She'd grown up as daughter of Boston's mayor, so she understood politics and image-making. She would raise their 9 children here, train them, shape them into the dynasty Joe envisioned. The children would learn early that Kennedys didn't lose. Touch football games on the lawn weren't casual play. They were competitions with winners and losers. Sailing races from the dock weren't recreation. They were tests of skill and determination. Even dinner table conversations were debates where you had to defend your positions or be dismissed. Joe Kennedy believed that wealth without power was meaningless, and power in America came through politics. His children would enter public service. They would win elections. They would reshape America according to Kennedy vision. The compound was where that training would happen. The main house became the center of operations, large enough to host gatherings, formal enough to impress visitors, but designed primarily as a family headquarters. Joe's study where he conducted business, a dining room where the family ate together and children learned to argue and persuade, bedrooms for all 9 children, though they'd often be packed in together. The waterfront was perhaps the most important feature, a private dock, a beach, access to Nantucket Sound. The Kennedy children would spend hours here, swimming, sailing, racing each other constantly. Joe believed physical competition built character and toughness. His children would be athletes as well as scholars. Rose managed the household with strict Catholic discipline. Daily mass, prayers, rules about behavior and appearance. She balanced Joe's aggressive competitiveness with religious structure. The children would be raised to win, but also to maintain proper appearances and moral standards, at least publicly. The neighbors in Hyannisport weren't thrilled about the Kennedys. Irish Catholics in their WASP sanctuary. New money pretending to be old money. Children who were too loud, too competitive, too present. But there was nothing they could do. Kennedy had bought the property. He was staying, and he was already planning the next phase. One compound wasn't enough. He needed a winter headquarters too. Somewhere warm where the family could escape New England cold, and where he could conduct business away from Boston scrutiny. He was already looking at Palm Beach. The Hyannisport purchase in 1928 was the foundation. Everything that followed, the political careers, the presidency, the tragedies, all connected back to this moment. This property. This decision to force his way into elite American society and create a dynasty that would dominate for generations. Joe Kennedy stood on the porch of his new compound and looked at his children playing on the lawn. He saw future senators, possibly a president, definitely a family that would matter, that would be remembered. He couldn't see what else the compound would witness: the telegram deliveries announcing deaths, the funeral gatherings, the empty bedrooms, the media sieges during scandals, the transformation from symbol of success to reminder of loss. In 1928, all of that was invisible. Joe Kennedy had his kingdom. Now he just had to build his dynasty. Chapter 2. 3 houses, 9 children, 1 dream. The Hyannisport compound wasn't just one building. It was 3 houses arranged on 6 waterfront acres. And that arrangement was intentional. Joe Kennedy was planning for a dynasty that would last generations. The main house sat at the center, 2.5 stories, white clapboard siding, wide porches. This was where Joe and Rose lived with their 9 children when they were young, the center of operations, the place where decisions were made and rules were enforced. 2 smaller houses flanked the main residence. They looked similar, same architectural style, same New England aesthetic, but they served a specific purpose in Joe's vision. When his sons grew up and married, they wouldn't move away. They'd take these houses. They'd stay on the compound. The family would remain together, physically and politically. This was unusual even for wealthy families. Most children eventually established their own households elsewhere. But Joe Kennedy didn't want a scattered family. He wanted concentrated power. Everyone under his influence. Everyone working toward the same goals. Rose Kennedy managed the daily operations. 9 children required organization. Joseph Jr., born 1915. John, born 1917. Rosemary, born 1918. Kathleen, born 1920. Eunice, born 1921. Patricia, born 1924. Robert, born 1925. Jean, born 1928. And Edward, born 1932. The age spread was 17 years from oldest to youngest. This meant Rose was constantly managing children at different stages, babies and teenagers simultaneously. The compound buzzed with activity every summer, voices, running, constant motion. The layout helped. The main house had bedrooms for all 9 children, though they often doubled up. Boys in some rooms, girls in others. Privacy was limited. You learned to exist in crowds, to compete for attention, to speak up or be ignored. The dining room was where family culture was most visible. Long table. All 11 people seated for meals. Joe at the head, Rose nearby. Children arranged by age or by Joe's current favor. Dinner wasn't relaxation, it was education. Joe would quiz his children on current events, politics, business news. If you hadn't read the newspaper that day, you'd be embarrassed at dinner. He wanted them informed, aware, ready to debate. He'd take positions just to make them argue back, to force them to defend ideas under pressure. The competition extended beyond the dinner table. The compound's lawn became a battlefield for touch football, not casual games, serious competitions. Joe kept score. He cared who won. The message was clear. Kennedys don't lose. Second place is failure. John was smaller and frequently sick as a child. Various illnesses kept him weakened, but he still had to compete with Joe Jr., who was bigger, stronger, more naturally athletic. John learned to compensate with strategy and toughness. The physical inequality between the brothers would shape both their personalities. The waterfront was constant activity. The compound had a private dock jutting into Nantucket Sound. Several sailboats. The Kennedy children spent hours racing each other. Joe would watch from the porch, noting who won, who gave up, who showed determination when behind. Swimming was mandatory. All the children had to learn young. The water was cold, but that didn't matter. Joe believed comfort made you soft. His children would be tough. They'd endure discomfort without complaining. Rose enforced this with religious discipline. Suffering built character, she taught them. Rose's influence was different from Joe's, but equally strong. She was devoutly Catholic. She insisted on daily prayers. Sunday Mass was non-negotiable. She'd take the children to church in Hyannis Village. They'd sit together, highly visible, the large Catholic family that didn't quite fit into Protestant Cape Cod. She also maintained strict standards for appearance and behavior, especially for the daughters. How you looked mattered, how you dressed mattered. The Kennedys were being watched. They needed to project success, discipline, control. Even at the beach there were standards. But Rose also showed affection that Joe rarely displayed. She'd read to the younger children. She'd comfort them when they were sick. She created warmth in a household that Joe's competitiveness could make harsh. The balance between Joe's demands and Rose's care defined the compound's atmosphere. The summers fell into patterns. Morning athletics, afternoons sailing or at the beach, evenings with Joe quizzing them, pushing them, preparing them for lives in public service. Weekends brought visitors, politicians, businessmen, anyone Joe thought his children should meet and learn from. But even in these early years, there were signs of strain. Rosemary, the third child and first daughter, struggled to keep up. She was slower to learn than her siblings. Her physical coordination was weaker. In a family obsessed with competition and winning, this was noticed. She tried hard but couldn't match her brothers and sisters. Joe and Rose initially hoped Rosemary would catch up. Perhaps she was just developing slowly. They hired tutors. They sent her to special schools. But the gap between Rosemary and her siblings widened as they grew. In family football games, she couldn't keep up. At dinner debates, she couldn't follow the quick arguments. The other children were mostly kind to her. Kathleen especially watched out for her older sister. But the compound's competitive culture was hard on anyone who couldn't compete. Rosemary felt the difference. She knew she was disappointing her father. Joe Kennedy's vision for the compound depended on all his children succeeding, performing, contributing to the family's rise. A child who couldn't do that threatened the image he was building. This would have consequences that wouldn't become clear until the 1940s. But in the 1930s, the compound was mostly what Joe envisioned: a training ground, a place where his children learned to win, to compete, to present themselves as future leaders. The houses themselves became part of that training. You lived in public within the family. You learned to perform, to maintain appearance, to never show weakness. The neighbors in Hyannisport grew somewhat accustomed to the Kennedy chaos, the loud touch football games, the constant activity, the children who seemed to be everywhere. Some remained disapproving. The Kennedys were still outsiders, still Irish Catholic and WASP territory, still new money pretending otherwise. But Joe Kennedy didn't care about their approval anymore. He had what he wanted: the location, the property, the setting for his dynasty. His older sons were approaching college age. Soon they'd enter the world, trained at the compound, ready to compete. Joseph Jr. was being groomed for politics. Joe made this clear. The oldest son would be the one. He'd go to Harvard. He'd go to law school. Eventually he'd run for Congress, then Senate, possibly the presidency. The entire family structure was being organized around Joe Jr.'s future political career. John was the second son, the backup plan. He'd also go to Harvard. He'd also prepare for public service. But the spotlight was on Joe Jr. John understood this. He lived in his older brother's shadow. The compound made that hierarchy visible every day. Joe Jr. was bigger, stronger, more confident. John was often sick, more introspective, trying to find his place. The younger children were still young in the 1930s. Robert was quiet, sensitive, different from his older brothers. The girls were being raised with the same competitive spirit but different expectations. They'd marry well. They'd support their brothers' careers. That was their role in Joe's vision. By the late 1930s, the compound had become exactly what Joe intended: a Kennedy kingdom, a place where outsiders became insiders through force of will and money, a training facility for a family that would dominate American politics. But Joe Kennedy was already thinking ahead. The compound served its purpose for summers. But he needed a winter headquarters too, somewhere he could take the family during cold months, somewhere he could conduct business away from Boston and New York scrutiny. He was looking south to Florida, to Palm Beach, to building a second court for his growing dynasty. The Hyannisport compound was the foundation, but it was only the beginning. Chapter 3: The Winter Palace, Building a Second Court. 1933. America was in the depths of the Great Depression. Banks had collapsed. Unemployment reached 25%. Families lost homes. Bread lines stretched around blocks. But Joe Kennedy wasn't suffering. He'd seen the crash coming and pulled his money out of the stock market in time. While others lost everything, he remained wealthy. And he was about to get wealthier through someone else's desperation. Palm Beach, Florida had been a playground for millionaires in the 1920s. Enormous estates lined the Atlantic coast. Mediterranean revival mansions with red tile roofs and arched windows, tropical gardens, private beaches. The wealthy had built elaborate winter retreats to escape northern cold. But the Depression changed everything. Many of those wealthy families weren't wealthy anymore. They needed to sell, and properties that had cost millions in the 20s were available for fractions of their original prices. Joe Kennedy was watching. The estate he found was called La Guarida, Mediterranean revival style, elegant proportions. Not as massive as some Palm Beach mansions, but substantial enough. Located on North Ocean Boulevard, the prestigious street where the richest families built. The property included the main house, manicured grounds, pool, and Atlantic Ocean frontage. The price was far below what it would have cost before the crash. The desperate seller accepted Joe's offer. By late 1933, the Kennedy family had a second headquarters. Hyannisport for summer, Palm Beach for winter, 2 courts for an American dynasty. The properties served different purposes. Hyannisport was where the children trained, where they competed, where they learned toughness. It was relatively informal despite its elegance. Children running everywhere. Touch football, sailing, constant activity and noise. Palm Beach was different. More formal, more refined. The architecture itself suggested this. Mediterranean revival wasn't casual New England clapboard. It was sophisticated. The arched windows, the tile work, the carefully designed gardens, everything spoke of elegance rather than rustic simplicity. Joe used Palm Beach differently than Hyannisport. This was where he conducted business that he didn't want scrutinized in Boston or New York, where he hosted people and made deals away from northern watchfulness, where he could relax somewhat, though Joe Kennedy never fully relaxed. Rose adapted to managing 2 households. The logistics were substantial. 9 children, staff at both properties, coordinating moves between Massachusetts and Florida, packing, travel, maintaining standards at both locations. She treated it like military operations because that's what it required. The family's annual rhythm became established. Summer at Hyannisport, fall in Boston where the children attended school, winter holidays in Palm Beach, spring back to Boston, then to Hyannisport when school ended. The constant movement between properties became normal for the Kennedy children. Palm Beach exposed them to different society than Cape Cod. The families wintering in Palm Beach were often wealthier than Hyannisport's old money WASPS industrialists. Banking families, people with national rather than regional power. Joe wanted his children meeting these people, learning from them, understanding how real power operated. The Palm Beach estate also provided something Hyannisport couldn't: genuine privacy. Cape Cod was small, everyone knew everyone. The Kennedys were always visible there, but Palm Beach was larger, more spread out. The estate's walls and tropical landscaping created seclusion. Joe could have meetings, make phone calls, conduct business without neighbors watching. For the children, Palm Beach meant different activities. No sailing in cold water. Instead, the pool, tennis. The beach was warmer, more comfortable than Cape Cod's rocky shores. The pace was somewhat slower, though Joe still insisted on competition and achievement. The daughters especially enjoyed Palm Beach. The social scene was more sophisticated than Hyannisport. Parties, dances, opportunities to meet people from across the country rather than just New England. Kathleen, called Kick by everyone, particularly thrived in Palm Beach's social atmosphere. But the 2 properties created pressure too. The Kennedy children lived nowhere long enough to establish deep roots outside family. Their friends were often temporary. Summer friends at Cape Cod, winter friends in Palm Beach, school friends in Boston. The family itself became their primary social world. This increased Joe's control, but also isolated them somewhat. Joe Jr. and John, as they entered their 20s, began using both properties for their own purposes. Joe Jr. would invite his Harvard friends to visit. John, despite frequent illness, did the same. The houses became showcases for the rising Kennedy generation, places to impress people, to demonstrate wealth and position. Rosemary's struggles became more apparent as she grew older. The competitive atmosphere at both properties was hard on her. In Palm Beach's more formal setting, her intellectual limitations were more obvious. She couldn't follow conversations the way her siblings could. Social situations that came easily to her sisters were difficult for her. Joe and Rose tried various approaches, more schools, more tutors, but nothing closed the gap between Rosemary and her siblings. By the late 1930s, it was clear she'd never catch up. This frustrated Joe deeply. In his vision of Kennedy perfection, Rosemary was a problem that needed solving. The late 1930s brought Joe Kennedy to new prominence. President Roosevelt appointed him ambassador to Britain in 1937. This was the peak Joe had been building toward, an Irish Catholic as ambassador to the court of St. James. It was validation, proof that the outsider had forced his way to the very center of power. Joe moved to London for the ambassadorship. Rose and the younger children often stayed at the Palm Beach and Hyannisport properties. The older children were at college or in Europe. For a brief period, the 2 estates were less crowded, quieter. But Joe's ambassadorship didn't last long. His statements about Britain and Germany became controversial. He opposed American entry into the war that was clearly coming. He spoke favorably about accommodation with certain political movements in Europe. This made him unpopular and politically damaged. He resigned in 1940, returning to America with his political reputation wounded. The properties became refuges, places where Joe could retreat from public criticism. He'd failed in his own political career. That meant everything now focused on his sons. Joe Jr. would have to achieve what Joe Sr. couldn't. The dynasty plan was more important than ever. By 1941, both Hyannisport and Palm Beach were established as Kennedy power centers. The family moved between them seasonally. Both were known as Kennedy properties. Both were where deals were made, plans were formed, and the next generation was prepared for public life. The two estates represented different faces of Kennedy ambition. Hyannisport, competitive, aggressive, informal, but intense. Palm Beach, elegant, sophisticated, calculated. Together they provided everything Joe needed to build his dynasty, but they would also witness what came next. The war that was about to start would touch both properties. Deaths would be announced at both. Grief would be felt in both. The houses Joe built to showcase success would become places where families gathered to mourn. In 1941, that future wasn't visible yet. Joe Kennedy had his kingdom. 2 estates, 9 children being prepared for greatness. Everything was going according to plan. The property stood ready to serve the dynasty for generations. War was coming, and it would change everything. For the family, for the country, and for the 2 estates that were supposed to represent permanent Kennedy power. Chapter 4. Rosemary, the daughter who disappeared. Rosemary Kennedy was born in 1918, the 3rd child and eldest daughter. For the first few years, the differences weren't obvious. She was a beautiful child, smiling in family photos, playing with her siblings. But as she grew, the gap between Rosemary and the others widened. She learned to read later than her brothers. Her handwriting remained childish when theirs improved. Physical coordination came harder to her. In a family where everyone competed constantly, where dinner conversations were rapid debates, where you had to be quick or be dismissed, Rosemary fell behind. The exact nature of her condition was never fully diagnosed. Some historians believe it was related to oxygen deprivation during birth. The delivery was difficult. Rose's doctor was delayed. A nurse allegedly held the baby back until the doctor arrived, potentially causing brain injury. But this was never confirmed medically. What was clear was that Rosemary had intellectual disabilities. In modern terms, she might be described as having an intellectual development disorder. Her IQ was estimated around 70, though testing then was imprecise. She could read and write at an elementary level. She could hold simple conversations. But complex reasoning was beyond her reach. Joe and Rose tried everything: special schools, private tutors, different approaches to education. They hoped she'd catch up, that with enough effort and resources, the gap would close. It didn't. By her teenage years, it was obvious Rosemary would never match her siblings intellectually. This created a problem for Joe Kennedy's vision. His dynasty plan required successful, accomplished children. Rosemary's limitations threatened the image he was building. He worried about her future. What would happen to her as she got older? Would she be taken advantage of? Would she embarrass the family? Rose tried to include Rosemary in normal family activities at both Hyannisport and Palm Beach. She'd bring her to social events, dress her beautifully, coach her on what to say. Rosemary tried hard. She wanted to make her parents proud. But the effort was visible, and the results were mixed. Her siblings generally treated her kindly. Kathleen especially watched over her. But even kindness couldn't change the fundamental reality. While her brothers debated politics, Rosemary sat quietly. While her sisters managed complex social situations, Rosemary needed guidance for simple ones. The distance between her abilities and theirs grew more apparent each year. As Rosemary entered her 20s, new concerns emerged. She was a beautiful young woman. She was interested in young men. She attended social events and dances. Joe worried about her vulnerability. In his mind, her intellectual limitations made her unable to make sound judgments. He feared she could be exploited or become pregnant. There's also evidence that Rosemary's behavior was becoming more difficult to manage. Some accounts suggest she had mood swings and could be aggressive when frustrated. Whether this was true or exaggerated by Joe to justify what came next remains debated by historians. In 1941, Joe made a decision. He'd heard about a new treatment for behavioral and intellectual issues: lobotomy. The procedure was being promoted by some physicians as a solution for various conditions. It involved severing connections in the brain's frontal lobe. The surgery was experimental. The success rate was unclear. The risks were enormous. But Joe convinced himself it might help Rosemary, or perhaps he convinced himself it would make her easier to manage. Historical accounts differ on his exact reasoning. What's certain is that Joe arranged for the procedure without fully informing Rose. Some historians say he told her nothing. Others say he downplayed what was involved. Either way, Rose wasn't present for the decision or the surgery. In November 1941, at age 23, Rosemary underwent the procedure at George Washington University Hospital. The doctors kept her awake during surgery. They asked her to recite prayers and sing songs. When she could no longer respond coherently, they knew they'd cut enough. The operation was a catastrophe. Rosemary emerged with the mental capacity of a 2-year-old. She could barely walk. Her speech was largely gone. She was incontinent. The daughter who had limitations but maintained independence was now completely incapacitated. Joe immediately moved her to a facility, first to a psychiatric hospital in upstate New York, then in 1949 to St. Coletta School in Wisconsin, a Catholic institution that cared for people with developmental disabilities. Rosemary would spend the rest of her life there, never returning to Hyannisport or Palm Beach. The family was told Rosemary was teaching mentally challenged children at a school in Wisconsin. This was the official story. Many of the younger Kennedy children believed it for years. They were discouraged from visiting. Joe said it would upset Rosemary to see family and then have them leave. Rose eventually learned the truth about what had happened. Her reaction isn't fully documented, but she was reportedly devastated. Her daughter had been permanently damaged by a procedure Rose hadn't fully understood or approved. But in the Kennedy family, you didn't contradict Joe. Rose accepted the situation, though it clearly pained her. At Hyannisport, Rosemary's bedroom remained, but she was gone. Her siblings were told not to discuss her. The family presented a united front to the public, everyone successful, accomplished, perfect. Rosemary didn't fit that image anymore, so she was erased from the narrative. The decision haunted the family. Years later, some of the siblings expressed guilt about not protecting their sister. Kathleen especially felt she'd failed Rosemary. But in 1941, the family pattern was established. Loyalty to Joe's vision above everything else, even above protecting one of their own. Rosemary lived at St. Coletta for decades. The Kennedy family paid for her care but rarely visited. Joe never saw her again after sending her there. He couldn't face what he'd done. Rose eventually visited, but infrequently. The younger siblings weren't allowed to see her until they were adults and could make their own decisions. The secret was kept until the 1960s. The public didn't know Rosemary had been institutionalized or why. The family maintained the fiction of her teaching in Wisconsin. Only when the family's profile was so high that investigations became inevitable did the truth start to emerge. Rosemary's treatment reflected both the medical ignorance of the era and Joe Kennedy's ruthless approach to problems. Intellectual disability wasn't understood well. Lobotomy was seen as progressive treatment by some doctors. But Joe's decision to pursue it without Rose's full knowledge, and his willingness to hide Rosemary away permanently when it failed, showed how far he'd go to maintain his perfect family image. The two estates, Hyannisport and Palm Beach, had been built as stages for Kennedy's success. Rosemary's story showed what happened when a Kennedy didn't fit the success narrative. You were removed, hidden. Your room stood empty while the family moved on, continuing to project the image Joe demanded. Rosemary Kennedy lived until 2005. She spent 64 years institutionalized because of a procedure that was supposed to help her. Her siblings, when they finally learned the full truth, were horrified. Some became advocates for people with intellectual disabilities, perhaps trying to atone for what happened to their sister. But in 1941, Rosemary simply vanished from Kennedy family life. The daughter who'd worked so hard to meet impossible standards was gone. And the family, gathered at Hyannisport and Palm Beach, closed ranks around the secret. The first Kennedy to be sacrificed for the Dynasties' image. She wouldn't be the last. Chapter 5. War Comes Home, 1944. The telegram arrived at Hyannisport on August 13, 1944. A Western Union messenger delivered it to the main house. Joe Kennedy opened it. His eldest son, Joseph Patrick Kennedy, Jr., was dead. The war had been inevitable. After Pearl Harbor in December 1941, all the Kennedy sons of fighting age enlisted. Joe Jr. joined the Navy and trained as a pilot. John also joined the Navy, eventually commanding a patrol torpedo boat in the Pacific. Even young Robert, though still too young for combat, prepared to serve. For Joe Jr., military service was part of the plan. The war would make him a hero. War records helped political careers. His father had mapped it out: serve with distinction, return home, run for Congress, eventually the presidency. Everything was proceeding according to design. John's experience came first. In August 1943, his PT boat was rammed by a Japanese destroyer in the Solomon Islands. The boat split in half. 2 crew members died. John and the survivors swam to a small island. John towed an injured crew member for hours, the man's life jacket strap clenched in his teeth. They survived for days before rescue. The story made newspapers. John Kennedy, the officer who saved his crew. His father ensured the story received maximum coverage. John received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for heroism. He returned home in early 1944, still recovering from injuries, but a certified war hero. Joe Jr. watched this unfold. His younger brother, the sickly one who'd always been second, was now a decorated hero. The newspapers praised John. People asked Joe Jr. about his heroic brother. The competitive dynamic that had defined their childhood at Hyannisport intensified. Joe Jr. needed to match or exceed what John had done. He volunteered for Operation Aphrodite. The mission was dangerous, experimental, possibly suicidal. Bomber planes would be loaded with explosives, far more than they'd normally carry. Pilots would fly them toward targets, set the controls, then parachute out before impact. The unmanned explosive-packed planes would hit German installations. The risks were obvious: mechanical failures, navigation problems, explosions before pilots could escape. But Joe Jr. saw opportunity. If the mission succeeded, he'd be the hero who took on the most dangerous assignment. It would overshadow John's PT boat story. He'd be back in the spotlight where he belonged. On August 12, 1944, Joe Jr. and his co-pilot took off from England in a modified bomber packed with explosives. The plan was to fly toward the target, arm the explosives, set autopilot, then bail out. Escort planes would guide the unmanned bomber to its target. Something went wrong. Witnesses in the escort planes saw a massive explosion. Joe Jr.'s bomber disintegrated in midair over the English countryside. Both pilots died instantly. Almost nothing remained. The explosion was so complete that there were no bodies to recover. At Hyannisport, the family was gathered for summer. Rose had been at church when the telegram arrived. Joe Sr. received the news alone in the main house. When Rose returned, he told her. Their firstborn son, the one they'd invested everything in, the future senator, future president, gone. The family gathered in the main house living room. Joe sat in his chair. Rose wept. The younger children struggled to understand. John was still recovering from his own war injuries. Now he'd have to carry the burden his older brother was meant to bear. Joe Jr.'s bedroom at the compound remained as it was. his trophies from school, his photographs, his books. The room became a shrine to what might have been. Joe Sr. couldn't face closing it. For months, maybe years, the door stayed open, the room preserved exactly as Joe Jr. had left it. The war had been supposed to create Kennedy heroes who'd return home for political careers. Instead, it had taken the son everything was built around. Joe Sr. aged visibly in the months after. The driving energy that had pushed his children so relentlessly was diminished. Not gone, but damaged. Meanwhile, complications from another Kennedy war experience emerged. Kathleen had married William Cavendish, Marquis of Hartington, in May 1944, an English Protestant aristocrat. The marriage had been against her parents' wishes. Catholic Rose especially opposed it. But Kathleen, called Kick, had gone ahead anyway. The marriage lasted 4 months. In September 1944, William was killed in combat in Belgium. Kick was now a widow at 24. She chose to remain in England rather than return to America. Her place was with her husband's family, she decided. The Cavendishes had accepted her. She felt she belonged there now. This created tension with Hyannisport. Joe and Rose wanted their children close, under their influence. Kick's decision to stay in England represented independence they hadn't planned for. She was choosing her own path rather than following the family script. The compound that summer and fall of 1944 was different from before. 2 sons had been supposed to return as heroes. One was dead. One was injured and struggling with his own trauma. A daughter had married outside the faith and was now widowed and living abroad. The war that was supposed to advance Kennedy ambitions had instead brought loss. Joe Jr.'s death particularly damaged the family's future plans. Everything had been structured around him. He was the political heir. John was supposed to be the backup, perhaps a Senate career, while Joe Jr. aimed for the presidency. Now John would have to be the front man, a role he'd never been prepared for. The flag at Hyannisport flew at half-mast. Visitors came to pay respects. Politicians who'd expected to work with Joe Jr. someday expressed condolences, but condolences didn't change the reality. The firstborn son, the carefully groomed heir, was gone. Joe Sr. threw himself into ensuring John would take Joe Jr.'s place. John wasn't enthusiastic about politics. He'd considered journalism, teaching, maybe writing. But his father's plans didn't allow for those options. Joe Jr. was dead. Someone had to fulfill the vision. John was now that someone. The compound, which had been a training ground for Joe Jr.'s political career, became the same for John. The pressure shifted from the dead son to the living one. The bedroom where John had always been second became the room of the heir. The weight of his father's expectations, already heavy, increased dramatically. Rose coped through faith. More church, more prayers, more rosaries. She'd lost a son, and her faith told her it was God's will. She'd accept it even if she didn't understand it. The Catholic stoicism she'd always practiced became more pronounced. The younger children watched this unfold. Robert saw his older brother's paths, one dead in war, one being pushed into politics he hadn't chosen. The Kennedy family pattern was clear. You served the dynasty's goals regardless of personal preference. Individual desires were secondary to family ambition. By late 1944, the compound felt different. The competitive energy was still there. Joe Sr. still pushed his children. But loss had entered, the first death that touched the family directly. The first time the Kennedy confidence was shaken. They'd believed they could win at everything. Now they knew they couldn't. The war continued. John eventually returned to civilian life. Kick remained in England. The younger children grew older, but Hyannisport in 1944 became the place where the Kennedys learned they weren't invincible, that their father's plans didn't guarantee success, that death could reach even them. Joe Jr.'s room stayed preserved, a reminder of what the family had lost, and a reminder of what John now had to become. The bedroom of the dead son looming over the living one. The weight of expectation transferred but not diminished. The war would end in 1945. The Kennedys would move forward. But something had changed at the compound. the first crack in the family's armor, the beginning of understanding that the dynasty Joe had built might have costs he hadn't anticipated. Chapter 6. Kick's Rebellion, from Hyannisport to French Alps. Kathleen Kennedy had always been different, outgoing, charming, less intimidated by her father than her siblings. At Hyannisport, while her brothers competed brutally and her sisters tried to meet impossible standards, Kick found her own path. She was social, popular. People were drawn to her warmth and humor. The war sent her to England. She worked for the Red Cross in London during the Blitz. Bombs fell nightly. Buildings collapsed. People died. But Kick thrived in the chaos. She attended parties, made connections, and met William Cavendish, Marquess of Hartington, heir to the Duke of Devonshire. William came from one of England's most prominent aristocratic families. Chatsworth House, vast estates, centuries of lineage. He was Protestant. Kick was Catholic. The religious divide created problems immediately. Joe Kennedy saw political advantage in the match. His daughter marrying into British aristocracy would cement Kennedy legitimacy. But Rose saw betrayal. Catholic doctrine was clear. Marrying outside the church was unacceptable. If Kick married a Protestant in a Protestant ceremony, she'd be committing mortal sin. Kick loved William. The religion problem seemed like something they could work around. They'd raise children Catholic, they agreed. But that wasn't enough for Rose. The ceremony itself mattered. A Protestant ceremony meant Kick would be excommunicated in Catholic eyes. The wedding happened in May 1944. A civil ceremony, not in a church. Rose refused to attend. Joe attended, seeing the political benefits, but the family was divided. Kick was choosing love and independence over her mother's approval. 4 months later, William was killed in combat, a sniper in Belgium. September 1944. Kick was a widow at 24. She could have returned to America, to Hyannisport, to family. Instead, she stayed in England. The Cavendish family welcomed her. She was their son's widow. They gave her rooms at their estates, included her in family affairs. For the first time, Kick wasn't defined primarily as a Kennedy. She was Lady Hartington. She had her own identity, her own place in society. Rose wanted her home, back to America, back to proper Catholic life, back under family control. But Kick refused. England was where she'd been happy with William, where she'd found acceptance. She'd visit America occasionally, but wouldn't move back. The years after William's death were complicated. Kick grieved, but also enjoyed her independence. She had money from the Cavendish family. She had social status. She moved in aristocratic circles. She was free from both her father's ambitions and her mother's religious strictures. Then she met Peter Fitzwilliam, Earl Fitzwilliam, enormously wealthy, charming, sophisticated, and married. He was separated from his wife, but not divorced. Catholic doctrine made this even worse than her first marriage. Dating a married man was absolutely forbidden. Kick didn't care. She'd already broken with church teaching by marrying Protestant. She'd chosen her own path once. She could do it again. She and Peter began a relationship that scandalized both the Cavendish family and her own. Joe Kennedy heard about the relationship and was furious. Not because of Catholic morality, Joe had never been particularly religious, but because the scandal could damage the family's image. John was beginning his political career. A sister openly dating a married man could hurt him. According to multiple accounts, though details vary, Joe threatened to cut Kick off financially if she continued with Peter. He demanded she end the relationship, choose family loyalty over personal happiness. Return to being a proper Kennedy daughter. Kick had a different plan. Peter's divorce would eventually come through. They'd marry. She'd face whatever consequences came. She'd already lost one husband. She wasn't going to lose another man she loved because her father disapproved. In May 1948, Kick and Peter planned a trip to the south of France. They'd discuss their future, make plans, possibly announce their engagement. They chartered a small private plane to fly from Paris to Cannes. The weather was terrible, a storm system over the Rhone Valley. Their pilot advised against flying, but they had reservations, plans. They decided to go anyway. The plane took off from Paris on May 13th, 1948. The storm was worse than anticipated. The small plane struggled. Visibility was near zero. The pilot tried to navigate through the weather. Somewhere over the French Alps, probably trying to find a way through the mountains, the plane struck a peak. Everyone aboard died instantly. Kik was 28 years old. Peter was 37. They were found days later when search parties finally located the wreckage high in the mountains. The news reached Hyannis Port by telegram. Another telegram announcing another death. Rose received it with complicated emotions. Her daughter was dead, but her daughter had also been living in sin with a married man. Rose's grief was mixed with a sense that this was somehow judgment for Kik's choices. Joe Sr. was devastated. Whatever anger he'd felt about Peter, Kik was still his daughter, the charming, independent child who'd brightened the compound. Gone. He'd threatened to cut her off financially. Now she was dead, and those threats were the last significant interaction they'd had. Neither Joe nor Rose attended the funeral. It was held in England, in the Cavendish family plot. The official explanation was that Joe couldn't travel due to health concerns. But many believed the real reason was that attending would mean acknowledging Kik's relationship with Peter. The Kennedys wouldn't publicly validate what they'd privately condemned. The Cavendish family buried Kik with full honors. She was Lady Hartington, William's widow. That's how England remembered her. The Kennedy family's absence was noted and created awkwardness. Their daughter was being buried, and they weren't there. At Hyannis Port, Kik's absence became permanent. Like Rosemary before her, though for different reasons. Rosemary had been hidden because she didn't fit the success narrative. Kik was gone because she'd chosen independence over family control. The pattern was emerging. Kennedy children who followed the script, Joe Jr. before his death, John now entering politics, were celebrated. Those who deviated were lost. Rosemary institutionalized. Kik dead after refusing to return to family orbit. The dynasty required conformity. Rose processed Kik's death through religious framework. Her daughter had strayed from church teaching, married a Protestant, then dated a married man. The plane crash, in Rose's view, might have been divine intervention preventing worse sin. She prayed for Kik's soul, but also seemed to believe the death carried meaning. Joe Sr. couldn't intellectualize it that way. He'd lost 2 children in 4 years. Joe Jr., the heir to everything he'd built. And Kik, the daughter who'd actually seemed happy, even if she'd chosen happiness outside family plans. The cost of the dynasty was becoming clear. The dining room at Hyannis Port, where all the Kennedy children had once gathered, now had 2 empty chairs. Joe Jr.'s place, Kik's place. The table was smaller. The competitive energy that had defined family meals was diminished. Death had entered the compound twice now, and both times it had taken children who were supposed to be part of the dynasty's future. John was in his early 30s, beginning his political career. He'd lost his older brother and one of his favorite sisters within 4 years. The family that had seemed invincible when he was growing up was revealing itself to be fragile. Success and loss were intertwined in ways his father had never acknowledged. The compound's meaning was shifting. It had been built as a training ground for success, but it was becoming a place where the family gathered to process loss, where telegrams arrived announcing deaths, where empty bedrooms reminded everyone of who was gone. By 1948, only 7 of Joe and Rose's 9 children remained. Rosemary was alive but gone, locked away in Wisconsin. Joe Jr. and Kik were dead. The family that was supposed to conquer American politics was being diminished by forces Joe couldn't control. The curse narrative was still years away. In 1948, people just saw tragic coincidences. A war death. A plane crash. Sad, but not supernatural. But the pattern had started. Kennedy ambition meeting Kennedy loss. The dynasty requiring sacrifices its architect hadn't anticipated. Kick's rebellion had ended in French mountains. Her refusal to conform, to return to Hyannisport, to accept family control, had led her to that plain. Whether different choices would have saved her is unknowable, but her death reinforced the family's belief that leaving the Kennedy orbit was dangerous, that independence from the dynasty led to disaster. The message was clear to the surviving children. Stay close. Follow the plan. Deviation was deadly. The compound was safety. Leaving led to loss. Whether this was true or just what the family needed to believe to make sense of tragedy, it became Kennedy doctrine. 2 more empty chairs, 2 more closed bedrooms. The compound built for Dynasty was becoming a museum of loss. Chapter 7. The Rise. JFK takes the compound. John Fitzgerald Kennedy never wanted to be a politician. He'd thought about journalism, maybe teaching. Writing interested him. His senior thesis at Harvard became a book, Why England Slept, about British appeasement before the war. He saw himself as an observer and analyst, not a participant in the arena. But Joe Jr. was dead. Someone had to fulfill Joe Sr.'s vision, and John was the only remaining option among the older sons. Robert was too young, still finishing school. It had to be John. His father made this clear. The family needed this. Joe Jr.'s death couldn't mean the end of Kennedy political ambitions. John's war injuries gave him problems. His back was damaged from the PT boat collision. He'd contracted malaria in the Pacific. He was often in pain. But the injuries also gave him a narrative, the war hero who'd saved his crew. His father ensured that story was told and retold. It became the foundation for John's political identity. In 1946, John ran for Congress from Massachusetts, 11th District, covering parts of Boston and Cambridge, working-class areas, Irish Catholic neighborhoods, the kind of places where Kennedy name recognition helped. The campaign was run from Hyannisport when possible. Joe Sr. coordinated everything. Strategy sessions at the main house, phone calls from his study. The compound became campaign headquarters. Money flowed from Joe's fortune. Nothing was left to chance. John won easily. At 29, he was Congressman Kennedy. He moved to Washington, but returned to Hyannisport regularly. The compound remained home base, where he recharged, where he got instructions from his father, where the family gathered to plan next moves. Being a congressman wasn't enough. Joe Sr. aimed higher. Senate, then presidency. The path Joe Jr. was supposed to take, John would now follow. The timetable was aggressive. John was young, but youth could be an advantage if marketed correctly. In 1952, John ran for Senate against Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. Lodge was an incumbent, well-established, from one of Massachusetts's most prominent old families. The kind of WASP aristocrat Joe Kennedy had spent decades trying to match. The campaign was brutal and expensive. Joe Sr. spent whatever it took. He called in every favor, used every connection. The Kennedy political machine, based from Hyannisport, operated at full capacity. Robert, just out of law school, managed the campaign. The family was all in. John won. Senator Kennedy at age 35. The victory was significant. A Kennedy had beaten a Lodge. Irish Catholic New Money had defeated Protestant Old Money. It validated everything Joe Sr. had worked toward. But John's personal life remained unsettled. He dated various women. Society girls, actresses, nothing serious. His father wanted him married. A politician needed a wife, especially if he was aiming for the presidency. Bachelor senators raised questions about stability and character. John met Jacqueline Bouvier at a dinner party in 1951. She was 12 years younger, sophisticated, beautiful, from a wealthy background, though not as wealthy as the Kennedys. She'd been educated in Europe. She spoke French fluently. She had the polish the Kennedys sometimes lacked despite their money. They married in September 1953 in Newport, Rhode Island. Massive wedding. Over 800 guests. Jackie wore a gown with 50 yards of silk. The reception was at her family's estate, Hammersmith Farm. It was society event of the season. But Jackie's introduction to the Kennedy family dynamic was jarring. She'd grown up in a quieter, more refined environment. The Kennedy compound was chaos by comparison. Loud voices, constant competition, touch football games where she was expected to participate, political discussions where everyone talked over each other. Joe Sr. claimed one of the smaller houses on the Hyannisport compound for John and Jackie. This was the original plan. His sons would live on the property even after marriage. John's house was steps from his parents'. Privacy was limited. Jackie found this suffocating. The competitive atmosphere that John had grown up with struck Jackie as childish. Grown men keeping score in touch football games, sisters competing over who had the best outfit, political one-upmanship at dinner. Everyone constantly trying to prove they were the smartest, fastest, most accomplished Kennedy in the room. Jackie retreated when she could. She'd escape to her own family's properties. She'd find excuses to be elsewhere. The Kennedy compound, which was supposed to be a dynasty headquarters, felt to her like a pressure cooker where she couldn't breathe. But the compound served its political purpose. Photographers came to capture the young senator at home with his beautiful wife. Images of John and Jackie at Hyannisport appeared in magazines. The sailboat, the beach, the casual elegance of summer on Cape Cod. It sold the Kennedy brand effectively. John's political career continued its rise. He wrote another book, Profiles in Courage, about senators who'd taken principled but unpopular stands. Published in 1956, it became a bestseller and won the Pulitzer Prize. Questions later emerged about how much John actually wrote versus how much was written by speechwriter Ted Sorensen, but the book enhanced John's intellectual image. By the mid-1950s, the Kennedy compound was operating as it was designed to. Political strategy developed there. Family meetings coordinated campaigns, the property's prestige added to the family's image. And John was positioned for the next step, the presidency. Joe Sr.'s health was declining. He'd turned 70 in 1958. His energy wasn't what it had been, but his ambition for his sons hadn't diminished. If anything, losing Joe Jr. made him more determined that John would reach the presidency. The dynasty couldn't end. It had to continue through the next generation. The compound also served as refuge from Washington. John's Senate work was often tedious. Committee meetings, constituent services, the day-to-day mechanics of legislation. But at Hyannisport, he could relax somewhat. Sail, swim, spend time with family. The compound represented escape from political grind, even as it remained political headquarters. Jackie struggled with this duality. She wanted a private life, separate from constant Kennedy family involvement. But that wasn't how the family operated. Everything was shared. Everything was discussed. Privacy was viewed as selfishness. The family came first, always. She also struggled with the compound's casual approach to infidelity. Joe Sr. had affairs throughout his marriage to Rose. This was known and tolerated within the family. John followed his father's pattern. He had relationships with various women even after marriage. At the compound, this was accepted as normal behavior for Kennedy men. Jackie knew, everyone knew, but the family expectation was that you didn't make it public. You maintained appearances. You stood by your husband. That's what Rose had done. That's what Kennedy wives did. Jackie found this arrangement painful but learned to navigate it. By 1958, John was preparing for a presidential run. The compound would be central to the campaign. Family meetings to plan strategy, photo opportunities showing the vibrant Kennedy clan. The properties, Hyannisport and Palm Beach, would project success, youth, vigor. Everything Joe Sr. had built toward was approaching fulfillment. John's house on the compound became his operational base when he wasn't in Washington. Staff, security communications equipment. The small house that had been part of the original compound purchase was now the home of a potential president. The transformation was complete. The property Joe bought in 1928, as an outsider forcing his way into WASP society, had become the headquarters of a political dynasty. The Irish Catholic family that wasn't supposed to belong was now producing a senator who might become president. Joe Sr. stood on the main house porch and looked at his remaining children. Joe Jr. and Kick were gone. Rosemary was institutionalized. but John was a senator. Robert was becoming a skilled political operator. The younger children were developing. The dynasty was working despite the losses. The compound had witnessed death and grief, but it had also been the training ground for success. The competitive atmosphere, the constant pressure, the relentless push for achievement, it had all served its purpose. At least one Kennedy was reaching the heights Joe had envisioned. In 1958, the future looked bright. John would run for president. He'd probably win. The compound would become the summer White House. Everything was proceeding according to the revised plan. What Joe couldn't see was that the brightest moment would also mark the beginning of the darkest period. That success and tragedy were about to intertwine in ways that would haunt the compound forever. That the properties he'd built to showcase Kennedy triumph would become monuments to Kennedy loss. But in 1958, standing on his porch at Hyannis Port, Joe Kennedy believed the dynasty was secure. His son would be president. The vision was becoming reality. The compound had served its purpose. Chapter 8. Bobby's Chaos. Hickory Hill. Robert Kennedy needed his own place. He'd managed John's Senate campaign. He'd worked in the Justice Department. He'd married Ethel Skakel in 1950. By the mid-1950s, they had several children and more coming. Living at the Hyannis Port compound or near his parents wasn't working anymore. In 1955, John bought an estate in McLean, Virginia, just outside Washington, Hickory Hill. A substantial property with a large house, extensive grounds, and history. It had been Civil War General George McClellan's headquarters. John thought he and Jackie would live there. Jackie visited the property and hated it. Too big, too far from Washington, too isolated. She wanted something smaller, more manageable, closer to the city, and she was pregnant, experiencing difficulties. The house felt wrong to her. She refused to live there. John sold it to Robert in 1957. Bobby and Ethel loved it immediately. The space, the privacy from Joe Sr.'s constant oversight, the possibilities. They moved in and began transforming it into something completely different from either Hyannisport or Palm Beach. Hickory Hill became chaos by design. Ethel wanted animals, lots of them. A horse named Geronimo that would sometimes wander into the house, dogs everywhere, a sea lion in the swimming pool at one point, a gift that proved impractical, chickens, ducks. The estate was part home, part zoo. The children multiplied rapidly. Ethel and Bobby would eventually have 11 children together. Kathleen, Joseph, Robert Jr., David, Mary Courtney, Michael, Mary Carey, Christopher, Matthew, Douglas, and Rory. The house was constantly filled with children running, shouting, playing. The atmosphere was completely different from Joe Sr.'s controlled compound. At Hyannisport, competition was organized and purposeful. At Hickory Hill, it was joyful chaos. Children climbed trees. They fell into the pool. They played with animals. It was structured disorder rather than Joe's regimented training. Bobby embraced this environment. He'd always been the quiet, sensitive Kennedy, less naturally aggressive than Joe Jr. or John, more emotional than his father approved of. At Hickory Hill, away from Joe's judgment, he could create his own version of family life. The pool became famous, not just for swimming, but for the parties. Political figures would visit, senators, cabinet members, journalists. At some point during the gathering, someone would get thrown into the pool fully clothed. Often multiple people. It became Hickory Hill tradition. You weren't really welcomed until you'd been thrown in the pool. Ethel encouraged this wildness. She'd grown up wealthy but less formally than the Kennedys. She was more spontaneous, more willing to embrace chaos. Where Rose Kennedy had managed 9 children with strict schedules and Catholic discipline, Ethel let her children be children. Rules existed but were loosely enforced. The house itself reflected this. Toys everywhere, pet supplies, athletic equipment. It looked lived in rather than maintained as showpiece. This was intentional. Hickory Hill wasn't trying to impress visitors with Kennedy elegance. It was a working family home where life happened loudly and messily. Bobby used Hickory Hill as his base as he rose in his brother's administration. When John became president in 1961, Bobby became Attorney General despite being only 35 and having limited legal experience. The appointment was controversial, but Joe Sr. insisted. Family loyalty mattered more than conventional qualifications. As Attorney General, Bobby worked from the Justice Department, but brought work home to Hickory Hill constantly. His study was filled with files. The phone rang at all hours. Staff came to the house for meetings. Political strategy sessions happened around the dinner table with children eating simultaneously. This blending of work and family life was Kennedy tradition. Joe Sr. had done it at Hyannisport, but Bobby's version was less formal. Advisors stepping over toys, strategy discussions interrupted by children asking questions. The boundary between professional and personal was permeable. The estate also became gathering place for the extended Kennedy family. John would visit from the White House when he needed to talk privately with Bobby. Eunice, Patricia, Jean, Bobby's sisters, would bring their families. The compound at Hyannisport was still the official family headquarters, but Hickory Hill became an alternative power center. This created some tension with Joe Sr. He'd built the Hyannisport compound specifically so the family would stay together under his influence. Bobby, establishing his own base in Virginia, represented independence. Not rebellion exactly. Bobby was loyal to family interests. But independence nonetheless. Joe Sr. had a stroke in December 1961. It left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. His control over the family loosened dramatically. Bobby, as John's closest advisor and attorney general, became more autonomous. Hickory Hill's importance as a Kennedy power center increased. The property served Bobby's political purposes well. Journalists who visited saw energetic, attractive family life. Photos of Bobby playing with his children appeared in magazines. It projected vigor and warmth. The Kennedy image, but with more humanity and less of Joe Sr.'s cold calculation. Bobby's children were being raised differently than he'd been raised. Less pressure. More affection. Bobby had experienced Joe's harsh methods and chose differently for his own family. He still wanted his children to succeed, to serve. But he didn't create the pressure cooker environment he'd grown up in. Ethel was central to this. She managed the household chaos with remarkable tolerance. Children injured themselves constantly. Broken bones were common with 11 children engaging in rough play. She took it in stride. Emergency room visits became routine. The family joke was that hospitals should give them a frequent visitor discount. The estate's grounds provided space for Kennedy athletic competitions, but with different tenor. At Hyannisport, Joe Sr. had turned games into tests. Winners were celebrated. Losers were shamed. At Hickory Hill, Bobby played with his children, but emphasized fun over winning. He'd learned what his father's approach had cost. But Hickory Hill wasn't separate from Kennedy destiny. Bobby was still serving the family's political goals. He was still intensely competitive in his work. The estate was where he could be a slightly softer version of himself, where the warmth he couldn't show in public could emerge with his family. The house also reflected Bobby's evolution. He'd started as Joe Jr.'s younger brother, then John's younger brother, always in someone's shadow. But by the early 1960s, he was becoming his own figure, Attorney General, his brother's most trusted advisor, a Kennedy with his own identity and his own base of operations. Hickory Hill represented a third Kennedy property with distinct character. Hyannisport was Joe Sr.'s creation, competitive, controlled, purposeful. Palm Beach was elegant and formal. Hickory Hill was chaotic, warm, filled with life in its messiest, noisiest forms. The three properties together showed the Kennedy family's range. Public image at Hyannisport, sophisticated retreat at Palm Beach, real life at Hickory Hill. Each served different purposes. Each projected different aspects of Kennedy identity. By 1963, Hickory Hill was firmly established as Bobby's kingdom. 11 children and counting, animals everywhere, political power flowing through the house, a Kennedy Center that was different from what Joe Sr. had built but still served the dynasty's needs. And Bobby stood on the Hickory Hill grounds and watched his children play. He'd found a way to be Kennedy while being himself, to serve the family mission while creating space for love and warmth. The estate was his version of what his father had built at Hyannisport. Similar purpose, different execution, better balance. What Bobby couldn't see was that Hickory Hill's joyful chaos was temporary. That tragedy was coming not just to Hyannisport, but to his own home. That the estate he'd filled with children's laughter would know grief, that he'd created warmth but couldn't protect it from what was approaching. In 1963, Hickory Hill was exactly what Bobby wanted it to be. A Kennedy estate that reflected his values rather than his father's. A place of joy despite the political pressures, a home where family life could be genuine rather than performed. The darkness would come soon enough. But in 1963, Hickory Hill was light. Chapter 9. The Summer White House, Peak Camelot. January 20th, 1961. John Fitzgerald Kennedy took the oath as 35th President of the United States. At 43, he was the youngest elected president in American history. Irish Catholic. The grandson of Irish immigrants. The son of Joe Kennedy, who'd forced his way into WASP society 30 years earlier. Joe Sr. watched from the inaugural platform. Vigorous. Proud. His son was president. The dynasty was real. Everything he'd built toward for decades was happening. The presidency transformed Hyannisport immediately. The compound that had been a private family estate became the Summer White House. Secret Service agents flooded the property. Communications equipment was installed. A helipad was built on the lawn. Security fences went up. The casual access neighbors had vanished. The main house required modifications. Secure phone lines to Washington. Space for staff. Areas for press briefings. The living room, where the Kennedy children had once competed at dinner debates, became a space where national security decisions were discussed. The other two houses on the compound, John's and the one designated for Robert, also needed security upgrades. The entire 6-acre property became a secured presidential facility during summer months. Local police coordinated with Secret Service. Coast Guard boats patrolled the waters offshore. The press corps established a presence in Hyannis. Hotels filled with journalists. Photographers waited outside the compound gates constantly. Every movement was documented. John sailing, Jackie and the children at the beach, Caroline riding her pony. The Kennedys at play became national news. This was exactly what Joe Sr. had envisioned. The compound showcased Kennedy's success. Photos from Hyannisport appeared in magazines worldwide. Life magazine, Look magazine, international publications. The images projected youth, vigor, beauty, optimism, American royalty in their summer palace. Jackie struggled with the exposure. She'd never liked the compound's chaos. Now privacy was completely gone. Cameras followed her everywhere. Her every outfit was analyzed. Her hairstyle was copied across America. She couldn't walk to the beach without photographers tracking her. She escaped when possible. To her family's estate in Rhode Island. To their private home in Virginia. Anywhere that offered relief from the constant Kennedy family presence and media attention. But summers at Hyannisport were expected. She had to perform the role of President's wife at the Summer White House. The Kennedy children adapted better. Caroline was born in 1957. John Jr., called John John by the press, was born just weeks after the election in November 1960. They were young enough that the Secret Service presence seemed normal. Agents became part of their daily life. The compound's famous touch football games continued, but with added pressure. When the president played, it became news. Photos of Kennedy family football games appeared in newspapers. What had been private family competition became public spectacle demonstrating Kennedy athleticism and competitive spirit. John used the compound strategically. When he needed to appear relaxed and confident, photos from Hyannisport helped. When political tensions were high, images of the president sailing in Cape Cod reminded Americans of his youth and optimism. The property was political asset. The sailing was genuine. John loved being on the water. It was one of the few activities where he could escape somewhat. Secret Service followed in another boat, but on the water he had space. The wind and waves drowned out the constant demands. It was the closest to privacy he could find. Visitors to the compound during the presidency ranged from family to world leaders. British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan visited. Military advisors came for strategy sessions. Cabinet members flew in for meetings. What had been a family compound was now conducting national business. The religious aspect complicated things. Hyannis Port was in a traditionally Protestant area. Having a Catholic president using it as summer White House made some locals uncomfortable. But most were proud. Their town was hosting the president. Property values increased. Tourism boomed. The economic benefits outweighed ideological concerns. Rose Kennedy thrived during this period. Her son was president. Visitors came to pay respects to the president's mother. She gave interviews about raising successful children. She attended church and everyone knew who she was. After decades of Joe being the dominant Kennedy, Rose had her own recognition. In December 1961, Joe Sr. suffered a massive stroke while playing golf in Palm Beach. He collapsed on the course. When he recovered consciousness, he was partially paralyzed on his right side. His speech was severely impaired. He could understand everything but could barely form words. The man who'd controlled his family through force of personality was suddenly unable to speak clearly. He was brought back to Hyannis Port to recover. A wheelchair, a nurse, staff to help him with basic needs. He could watch what he'd built, but couldn't direct it anymore. His son was president, but Joe couldn't give orders or advice the way he'd always done. The stroke had silenced him. Robert became John's closest advisor after Joe's stroke. The brothers had always been close, but now Bobby filled the role their father couldn't. They'd talk for hours at the compound. Strategy, politics, decisions. The partnership that would define John's presidency was cemented during this period. Joe spent hours in his wheelchair on the porch observing. Staff would position him where he could see arrivals and departures. He'd watch his son, the president, conduct business. He'd see grandchildren playing. He could witness what he'd created but couldn't participate. The frustration was visible. The compound also became gathering place for the extended Kennedy family. Robert came frequently from Hickory Hill. Eunice, Patricia, Jean with their families. Ted, the youngest Kennedy son, now a senator himself, was a regular presence. The compound during the presidency was command center for the entire Kennedy clan. But the security and attention changed the atmosphere. The competitive games were performed for cameras now. The casual beach time was documented. The privacy that had allowed genuine family moments was gone. Everything was public. Everything was image management. Jackie's frustration grew. She'd married a senator. That was manageable. But being First Lady while spending summers at Hyannis Port surrounded by Kennedys and press was exhausting. She began taking separate vacations. Greece, Italy, anywhere she could escape the compound and the role. The strain showed. Jackie was photographed less frequently at Hyannis Port as the presidency continued. When she was there, her discomfort was sometimes visible. She loved her husband, but she'd never loved his family's way of life. The compound concentrated everything she found difficult about being a Kennedy. John noticed but couldn't change much. The presidency required the image. Hyannis Port projected that image perfectly. The summer White House showed Americans a young, vital, optimistic first family. The compound was too valuable politically to abandon, just because his wife was uncomfortable. The children provided some authenticity. Caroline and John playing on the beach weren't performing. They were genuinely children having summer fun. Those moments felt real in ways adult Kennedy activities increasingly didn't. The press loved photographing them because their joy was unforced. By summer 1963, the compound had been summer White House for 2.5 years. The routine was established. Security protocols were smooth. The press knew where to position themselves. Local businesses had adapted to hosting presidential operations. It had become normal. The famous rocking chair sat on the porch. John's back problems required special seating. The rocking chair became iconic. Photographs of the president rocking on the porch at Hyannis Port symbolized thoughtful leadership. John would sit there for hours, reading briefing materials, making phone calls, conducting business. The compound represented the peak of Kennedy power, the presidency operating from the family estate. 3 generations of Kennedys gathering in the place Joe had purchased to establish their legitimacy. Everything he'd planned had come to fruition. Even if stroke had silenced him, he could watch it unfold. The foreign policy challenges were serious. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 had brought the world close to nuclear war. Vietnam was becoming complicated. Civil rights were creating domestic tension. But from Hyannis Port, with the sailing and the family and the sunshine, it could feel manageable. The summer of 1963 was beautiful. Long days, warm weather, the Kennedy children playing, John sailing, Rose attending church, Joe watching silently from his wheelchair, the extended family gathering. It felt like success, like permanence, like the dynasty was secured. Jackie took the children to the Cape in early September. Caroline needed to start school. The family would return to Washington. The summer season at Hyannis Port was ending. The compound would quiet down. The next summer they'd return and do it all again. No one knew that within months, everything would change. That the compound would transform from summer White House to site of national mourning. That the images of Kennedy happiness at Hyannis Port would become reminders of what was lost. That the peak moment was also the last moment before the fall. In September 1963, leaving Hyannis Port for Washington felt routine. The presidency would continue. The summers at the compound would continue. The dynasty Joe Sr. had built seemed unshakable. 2 months later, nothing would ever be the same. Chapter 10, November 22nd, 1963. The compound goes dark. Rose Kennedy was at church, St. Francis Xavier in Hyannis, Friday morning Mass. She attended almost every day. It was part of her routine, had been for decades. Faith had carried her through losing Joe Jr. and Kick. Faith would carry her through whatever came. She didn't know yet that something had come. Ted Kennedy was presiding over the Senate in Washington. Routine duty. A Friday afternoon. He was bored, going through the motions. An aide rushed in, whispered urgently. Ted's face changed. He left immediately, heading for the Senate cloakroom to make phone calls. At Hyannis Port, staff were cleaning the main house. The family wasn't there. The president was in Texas on a political trip. Jackie was with him. The compound was quiet, almost empty, just maintenance staff and Secret Service on reduced presence. The news came through televisions first, bulletins interrupting regular programming, shots fired in Dallas. The president hit, rushed to hospital, condition unknown. The networks scrambled to confirm details. Confusion, contradicting reports, then the confirmation. President Kennedy was dead. Ted reached Rose by phone. She'd returned from church, he told her. Their conversation was brief. Rose said she'd pray. What else could she do? Another son dead. The 3rd child she'd lost. She went back to church. Joe Sr. was in his room at the compound. The stroke had left him able to understand but barely able to speak. A nurse was with him. The television was on. He watched the coverage. Saw his son's body removed from the hospital. Saw Jackie in her pink suit stained with blood. He couldn't express what he felt. His face contorted. Tears came. He made sounds but not words. The nurse held his hand. There was nothing to say anyway. His son, the president. The culmination of everything he'd built, shot in Dallas. The compound filled rapidly. Secret Service flooded back. Family members converged from different locations. Robert drove up from Washington with Ethel. Eunice came. Patricia came. Jean came. The Kennedy siblings gathering as they'd always done in crisis. Back to the compound. Back to where it started. The press surrounded the gates. Cameras. Reporters. But they kept distance. Even journalists knew this wasn't the time for questions. They filmed the arrivals. captured images of Kennedy's returning home in grief, but they didn't intrude further. Inside the main house, the family gathered. The living room where they'd had so many dinners, where Joe Sr. had quizzed his children, where they'd debated and competed. Now they sat in silence. What was there to say? Robert was devastated. He and John had been closest, partners in the presidency. They'd talked every day. Now John was gone, and Bobby was supposed to continue somehow, to be Attorney General under Johnson, to carry on. But how? Ted was the last brother, 29 years old, youngest of the Kennedy sons. He'd always been the baby, protected somewhat from the pressure Joe Sr. put on the older ones. Now he was the only Kennedy son left. That weight was crushing. Rose maintained composure through faith, God's will. She'd said it when Joe Jr. died, when Kick died. She'd say it now. God had called John home. She would accept it. Her grief was private, processed through prayer. She wouldn't break publicly. Joe Sr. couldn't maintain composure because he couldn't speak. The sounds he made were anguished. Staff tried to comfort him, but nothing helped. He'd built everything around his sons' political careers. 2 were dead. 1 remained. The dynasty he'd envisioned was collapsing. Jackie arrived 2 days later, still wearing the blood-stained pink suit when she returned to Washington, refusing to change. But by the time she reached Hyannis Port, she'd finally changed clothes. Black dress, veil. She brought Caroline and John. The children needed to be with family. The compound became the site where America's first family processed national tragedy privately. The funeral would be in Washington, the burial at Arlington. But before and after, the Kennedys were at Hyannis Port, where they'd always come in crisis. The empty bedroom in John's house on the compound was unbearable. Jackie couldn't stay there. Too many memories. The house where they'd spent summers. Where the children had played. Where John had worked as president. She stayed briefly, then left, taking the children. She couldn't be at the compound anymore. The photographs of John were everywhere, on the porch in the rocking chair, sailing, playing with Caroline and John. Images that had represented success now represented loss. The compound was filled with ghosts. The helipad that had been built for presidential arrivals sat empty. The communications equipment that had connected the summer White House to Washington was dismantled. The Secret Service presence diminished. The compound that had been center of presidential power was just a family estate again, but a family estate marked by death. Robert wandered the grounds, the dock where they'd sailed, the lawn where they'd played football. Everything reminded him of John. They'd grown up here together, competed here, learned here. Now John was gone and Bobby was lost. The younger Kennedy generation was confused. Caroline was 5. She understood her father was gone, but not fully what that meant. John was 2 days short of his 3rd birthday. Too young to understand. The cousins, Bobby's children from Hickory Hill, the other siblings' children, tried to make sense of it. Their Uncle Jack, who'd been president, was dead. The compound's meaning had shifted again. It had been training ground, then power center, then summer White House. Now it was memorial. Every room held memories of John. Every space echoed with his absence. The flag flew at half-mast. It would stay that way for weeks. The compound that had projected Kennedy optimism and vigor now projected grief. The images news crews captured from outside the gates showed a darkened, quiet place. The energy was gone. Visitors came to pay respects. Politicians who'd worked with John. Friends from the PT boat crew. People whose lives he'd touched. The family received them in the main house. Condolences were offered. Stories were shared. But nothing helped. John was gone. Joe Sr. sat in his wheelchair and couldn't stop crying. The nurse would wipe his tears, but they kept coming. He'd lived to see his son become president. Now he'd lived to see that son murdered. The cruel mathematics of loss. He'd outlived 3 of his 9 children. The patriarch watching his dynasty die piece by piece. Rose tried to comfort him, but Joe was beyond comfort. The stroke had taken his ability to express himself. The assassination had taken his will to try. He sat in silence, broken only by sounds of grief he couldn't articulate. The compound would never be Summer White House again. That possibility died in Dallas. The house where a president had worked, where he'd hosted world leaders, where he'd made decisions affecting millions. It was just a house now. A house filled with sadness. Thanksgiving came days after the funeral. The family gathered at Hyannisport as they always did for holidays. But the gathering was hollow. The empty chair where John should have sat was unavoidable. The children tried to play normally. The adults tried to function. Neither succeeded. Robert gave thought to leaving politics. What was the point? His brother was dead. The dream was over. But family and advisors pressed him to continue. Kennedy's legacy couldn't end. Someone had to carry on. Robert was the one who remained. But his heart wasn't in it. Not yet. December brought Joe Sr.'s birthday. 75 years old. There was no celebration. How could there be? His son had been murdered weeks earlier. Joe sat in the main house, unable to speak, watching his family try to process grief. The man who'd pushed them all so hard couldn't offer guidance now. He couldn't speak at all. The compound in winter was always quiet, but winter 1963 was different. Not just quiet, but heavy. The weight of loss hung over everything. The houses, the grounds, the beach, the dock. All of it marked by what had happened in Dallas. Palm Beach was no better. The family went there for winter as usual, but the Florida estate couldn't escape the shadow either. Joe Sr. sat by the pool in his wheelchair, the same pool where he'd held court for decades, where he'd made plans for his sons' political careers. Now mostly silent except for his labored breathing and occasional sounds of grief. Jackie tried to build a new life. She bought a house in Georgetown, started planning the Kennedy Library, focused on her children, but she was marked forever by those moments in Dallas. The blood on her suit, the loss. Nothing would ever be normal again. The compound stood as a reminder of what had been. The Summer White House. The peak of Kennedy power. That moment in 1963 when everything seemed possible. When the young president sailed and played with his children and governed from his family estate. All gone. Murdered in Dallas. The compound couldn't be that place anymore. It could only be where the Kennedys came to remember. And to grieve. Chapter 11, 1968. 2 more deaths. Robert Kennedy didn't want to run for president. Not really. The years after John's death had been difficult. He'd stayed on as Attorney General briefly under Johnson, but resigned in 1964. He ran for Senate from New York and won. But his heart wasn't in politics the way it had been when John was alive. Hickory Hill sustained him. Ethel. The children. By 1968, they had 10 children with another on the way. The chaos and warmth of his Virginia estate provided refuge from the darkness that had settled over the family after Dallas. But pressure built for him to run. Vietnam was tearing the country apart. Johnson wasn't seeking re-election. The Democratic nomination was open. Many saw Robert as the Kennedy who could finish what John started, who could heal the nation's wounds, who could restore Camelot. Robert resisted. He'd seen what the presidency cost. His brother murdered, his father destroyed by grief, but friends and advisors pushed. Eugene McCarthy was challenging Johnson from the left. If Robert didn't run, McCarthy might win the nomination. Kennedy's legacy would be sidelined. In March 1968, Robert announced his candidacy. The campaign was based from Hickory Hill when he was home. The estate that had been refuge became headquarters again. Staff, volunteers, press. The controlled chaos multiplied. Ethel was pregnant with their 11th child, due in December, but she campaigned with Robert anyway, bringing children along, making appearances. The image was powerful. The large Kennedy family, vibrant and engaged, offering hope after years of national turmoil. The campaign was grueling. Robert was energized by crowds, but exhausted by the schedule. California was crucial. The primary there on June 4th would determine momentum. He needed to win California to have a real chance at the nomination. At Hyannisport, Joe Sr. watched on television. He could barely move now. The stroke damage had worsened. He was confined to a chair or bed. Staff had to do everything for him, but he could watch. And what he saw was his remaining political son putting himself in the same danger that had killed John. Rose prayed constantly. Another son in politics, another target. She'd lost Joe Jr. in war, lost John to an assassin. Now Robert was campaigning in a country that felt increasingly violent. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated in April. The nation was unstable. She feared for Robert but couldn't tell him to quit. Kennedy men didn't quit. California primary night, June 4th, 1968. Robert won. Not overwhelmingly, but clearly. He spoke to supporters at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. Victory speech. Optimism about moving forward. The campaign was alive. He had momentum. He left the podium through the hotel kitchen. Shortcut to the press room. Aides surrounded him. Ethel was just behind. The kitchen was crowded. Hotel staff, reporters, campaign workers. Robert shook hands as he moved through. A man stepped forward. Sirhan, 24 years old, Palestinian. He'd written in his diary about hating Robert Kennedy for supporting Israel. He had a revolver. He fired at close range. The first shot hit Robert in the head, behind the right ear. He fell immediately. 2 more shots hit him. Back and armpit. Sirhan fired wildly after that. 5 other people were hit. Pandemonium. People wrestling Sirhan to the ground. Screaming. Blood. Ethel reached Robert. He was conscious briefly, spoke a few words, asked about others who'd been shot. Then he lost consciousness. Paramedics arrived. They worked on him in the kitchen, transported him to Good Samaritan Hospital. Surgeons operated for hours. At Hyannisport, news reached the compound in the early morning hours. East Coast time. Another phone call. Another Kennedy shot. Ted was notified first. He had to tell his parents, Rose, and Joe, who couldn't respond except through tears and anguished sounds. The vigil lasted 26 hours. Robert never regained consciousness. Brain damage was too severe. On June 6, 1968, at 1:44 in the morning, Robert Kennedy was pronounced dead. He was 42 years old. Ethel was pregnant with their 11th child. The compound filled with family again. 5 years after Dallas, another gathering in grief, another empty chair, another Kennedy son dead. Ted was now the only surviving Kennedy brother. The weight of the dynasty fell entirely on him. Joe Sr. was beyond comfort. His nurse tried. His wife tried. Nothing penetrated. He'd lost a 3rd son, this one murdered like John, in a hotel kitchen, campaigning for president. The dynasty Joe had built was destroying itself. Everything he'd pushed his sons toward had led to death. Rose retreated to church. Hours of prayer. Rosaries. Mass daily, sometimes multiple times. Faith was all she had left. 3 children dead. 1 institutionalized. Only 5 remained. The family she'd raised at Hyannisport and Palm Beach was being decimated. Hickory Hill became a house of mourning. 10 children had lost their father. An 11th would be born, never knowing him. The estate that had been so full of life and noise was suddenly quiet. The children were traumatized. Some would never fully recover. The funeral was in New York. Robert was buried at Arlington near John. Brothers reunited in death. The television coverage showed Ted Kennedy giving the eulogy. Last brother. Speaking about the second brother to be assassinated, the impossibility of it was visible on his face. After the funeral, family returned to Hyannisport. The compound was the gathering place, where they'd always come. But it felt cursed now. 2 Kennedy brothers assassinated in 5 years. Both had used the compound. Both had been groomed there for politics. Both were dead. Joe Sr.'s health collapsed completely after Robert's death. The will to live was gone. He stopped eating properly, lost weight dramatically. The staff tried to keep him comfortable, but he was giving up. By November, 6 months after Robert died, Joe was fading. On November 18, 1968, Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr. died at Hyannisport. He was 81 years old. He'd outlived 3 of his sons. He'd watched his dynasty crumble. The stroke had silenced him for the last 7 years. Now, death silenced him permanently. The patriarch who'd bought the compound in 1928, who'd pushed his children relentlessly, who'd built a political dynasty through ambition and ruthlessness, who'd seen his son become president and then seen that son murdered, who'd lost another son 5 years later. Gone. Rose was now the last of that generation. She'd married Joe in 1914, 54 years of marriage, 9 children, 3 dead, 1 institutionalized. She was 78 years old and alone with memories and faith. The compound felt emptier than ever. Joe Jr.'s room still preserved, John's house standing unused, Robert buried in Arlington, Joe Sr. gone. The energy that had driven everything for 40 years was extinguished. Ted tried to carry on. He was only 36, but felt ancient, the last Kennedy brother, expected to continue the dynasty, to be the surviving political Kennedy, to fulfill what Joe Jr., John, and Robert had started. But he was traumatized, drinking more, making poor decisions. Hickory Hill was eventually sold by Ethel. She couldn't live there anymore. Too many memories of Robert. The house where they'd raised 10 children together, where Robert had been happy despite political pressures. She needed to escape it. The estate that had represented Kennedy warmth and chaos became another property marked by tragedy. The 3 Kennedy estates, Hyannisport, Palm Beach, Hickory Hill, had all been touched by death now. Joe Jr.'s death announced at Hyannisport. John's assassination mourned at both compounds. Robert's campaign based from Hickory Hill, leading to his murder. Joe Sr. dying at Hyannisport. The properties built to showcase success had become monuments to loss. Palm Beach especially felt haunted. Joe had suffered his stroke there, spent his final diminished years there. The elegant Mediterranean estate that had been winter headquarters was now just where the family went when Boston was too cold. But nobody wanted to be there. It reminded them of what they'd lost. By the end of 1968, the Kennedy family was shattered. The deaths, the trauma, the impossibility of continuing as they had. Ted was the only son left, and he was struggling. The younger generation was traumatized. The dynasty was broken. Rose remained at Hyannisport. She'd lived there for decades more, watching grandchildren grow, attending Mass, praying for her dead children. The compound became her domain, the place she'd managed for 40 years, now managing it alone. The houses stood, the grounds remained, but the meaning had changed completely, from training ground to power center to memorial. 3 Kennedy sons had been raised there. 2 were murdered. The 3rd carried impossible weight. The compound couldn't escape what it had witnessed. Chapter 12. Chappaquiddick, the last brother's shame. Ted Kennedy was the survivor, the youngest son, the one who wasn't supposed to carry the dynasty. Joe Jr. was the heir. John was the backup. Robert was the conscience. Ted was just the baby brother who'd go into politics, because that's what Kennedys did. Now he was the only one left, 37 years old in 1969. Senator from Massachusetts like John had been, expected to run for president eventually, expected to fulfill what his 3 dead brothers couldn't. The weight was crushing. He drank more than he should, made questionable decisions, had relationships outside his marriage that everyone knew about. But he was a Kennedy, the last Kennedy son. People forgave him, or at least looked away. The family had suffered enough tragedy. Let Ted have his flaws. July 18th, 1969. A year after Robert's death. Ted was on Martha's Vineyard, a short distance from Hyannisport. There was a party on Chappaquiddick Island, a reunion for women who'd worked on Robert's presidential campaign. Ted attended with his cousin Joe Gargan and friend Paul Markham. One of the women there was Mary Jo Kopechny, 28 years old, she'd been devoted to Robert's campaign. She'd been devastated by his death. She'd worked in Ted's Senate office after. She was smart, dedicated, idealistic. She believed in the Kennedys despite everything. Around 11:30 that night, Ted said he was leaving. He'd drive Mary Jo back to her hotel. She needed to catch a ferry in the morning. The party continued without them. Nobody thought much of it. Senator Kennedy giving a staff member a ride. Nothing unusual. Ted was driving his mother's Oldsmobile. Dark night, unfamiliar roads. He turned onto Dyke Road leading to a small bridge. The bridge was narrow, wooden, no guardrails. Used mainly during daytime by locals who knew it was there. What happened next has been disputed for over 50 years. Ted's account, given later, was that he missed the turn. The car went off the bridge into Poocha Pond. The car flipped, filled with water, sank. Ted escaped. He said he dove repeatedly trying to reach Mary Jo. The water was dark, cold, the current strong. He couldn't find her. He couldn't get her out. Eventually he gave up. He swam to shore, exhausted, in shock. Mary Jo was trapped in the car. As water filled the vehicle, she likely found an air pocket, survived for some time breathing in that small space, waiting for rescue that never came. Eventually the air ran out. She drowned. Ted didn't call police immediately. This is the part that destroyed him. He walked back to the party cottage, got Joe Gargan and Paul Markham. They returned to the bridge, tried to reach the car. Couldn't. It was underwater, invisible in the dark. Gargan and Markham urged Ted to report the accident immediately. He refused. He said he'd take care of it. He dove into the channel and swam across to Edgartown where he was staying. Left his cousin and friend behind. Went to his hotel room. Changed clothes. Appeared in the lobby briefly, establishing he'd been there. Then went to his room. He didn't call police, didn't call rescue services, didn't do anything. For 9 hours, Mary Jo's body was in that submerged car while Ted Kennedy slept in a hotel room. The next morning, 2 fishermen found the car. Upside down in the water, they called police. Divers recovered Mary Jo's body. The investigation began. Where was the driver? Who owned the car? Ted finally went to the Edgartown police station around 10 in the morning, nearly 10 hours after the accident. He reported what had happened. He was driving. He'd gone off the bridge. The passenger drowned. He claimed he'd been in shock, confused, disoriented. The story immediately had problems. The timeline didn't make sense. Why the 9-hour delay? Why had he left the scene? Why hadn't he called for help when there might have been time to save her? Why had he gone back to his hotel and slept while Mary Jo was dying or dead in the water? And there were darker questions. Had he been drinking? Was his judgment impaired? Had something else happened? Were he and Mary Jo having an affair? Why were they alone in the car late at night? What was he really doing on that road? The Kennedy family machine activated immediately. Lawyers flew to Martha's Vineyard. Damage control began. Ted would plead guilty to leaving the scene of an accident. A week later, he appeared in court. Received a 2-month suspended sentence and a year's probation. The legal consequences were minimal, but the political consequences were devastating. A week after the court appearance, Ted gave a television address. He wore a neck brace, claiming he'd been injured in the accident. Many doubted this. It looked like a prop to gain sympathy. He asked Massachusetts voters whether he should resign. The response was supportive. Don't resign. But national opinion was harsher. A Kennedy had left a woman to die, had delayed reporting for 9 hours, had protected himself while she drowned. This was unforgivable. At Hyannis Port, the family gathered. Rose was horrified, not just by what happened, but by how it looked. Another Kennedy scandal. Her last surviving son, disgraced. She prayed, but this time prayer didn't provide the comfort it usually did. The compound was surrounded by press again, not covering success or even mourning tragedy, covering scandal. The gates closed. The family tried to wait it out, but this wouldn't blow over quickly. The questions never stopped. Books were written analyzing the accident. Investigations continued for years. Grand juries, inquests, new evidence emerging, inconsistencies in Ted's story. The 9-hour delay remained unexplained satisfactorily. Mary Jo's parents, Joseph and Gwen Kopechny, buried their daughter. They accepted a settlement from Ted's insurance. They didn't push for criminal charges. But their grief was compounded by questions. What really happened to their daughter? Why did no one try to save her? Why did Ted Kennedy leave her there? Ted's presidential ambitions died in Pucha Pond along with Mary Jo. He'd been expected to run in 1972. He was a Kennedy, last surviving brother. He'd have won the nomination easily, probably won the presidency. The dynasty would have continued, but Chappaquiddick made that impossible. A man who'd left a woman to die couldn't be president. Americans could forgive many things. They'd forgiven Kennedy infidelities. They'd forgiven questionable business dealings, but leaving someone to drown while you went to your hotel room? That was unforgivable. Ted continued as senator. He'd served Massachusetts for decades more, become one of the most effective legislators in Senate history, pass important bills, help thousands of constituents. But he'd never be president. That possibility died on July 18th, 1969. The compound became associated with scandal now, not just tragedy. The properties Joe Sr. had built to showcase Kennedy's success were marked by death and disgrace. 2 brothers assassinated. The 3rd brother involved in a young woman's drowning death. The dynasty was over. Not officially. Kennedys would remain in politics for generations. But the dream Joe Sr. had built, the vision of Kennedy men dominating American politics through excellence and achievement, that was finished. Palm Beach estate felt cursed. Joe had had his stroke there, died thinking about it. The elegant property became something the family tried to avoid. Too many memories, too much loss. It remained in family ownership but was rarely used. Hickory Hill had been sold. The warmth and chaos Robert and Ethel created there was gone. The estate where Kennedy political operations had seemed hopeful became just another Virginia property. The magic had died with Robert. Hyannisport remained. Rose stayed there. Ted visited. The extended family gathered occasionally. But the energy was gone. The competitive spirit that had defined the compound for 40 years had been replaced by something darker. Obligation, guilt, survival. Ted Kennedy would live with Chappaquiddick for the rest of his life. Every political profile mentioned it. Every campaign faced questions about it. Every time he considered higher office, the 9-hour delay came up. Mary Jo Kopechny's name was forever linked with his. He tried to run for president once more in 1980. The campaign struggled. When asked by Roger Mudd why he wanted to be president, he couldn't articulate an answer. The ambition that had driven his brothers wasn't in him, and Chappaquiddick hung over everything. The last Kennedy brother survived, but survival came at a cost. He carried his brothers' unfulfilled dreams, his own disgrace, the weight of dynasty that had killed 2 brothers and destroyed another. He lived until 2009, 40 years after Chappaquiddick. The scandal never left him. Mary Jo Kopechny is buried in Pennsylvania. Her gravestone includes her dates and her devotion to Robert Kennedy's campaign. She believed in the Kennedys. That belief killed her. She drowned in Pucha Pond while Ted Kennedy slept. The 3 estates, Hyannisport, Palm Beach, Hickory Hill, had been built to project power and success. By 1969, they represented tragedy and scandal. The dynasty Joe Sr. envisioned had destroyed itself. The curse, if you believed in such things, was complete.